The Metroid Prime games. Out of every video game trilogy that there is, none even come close to how amazing these games are. Retro Studios managed to turn the 2D Metroid games into both something new and something interesting in 3D. What's impressive is that they managed to cross over a lot that made Super Metroid great. The atmosphere, the music, the real sense of exploring an area. I can't praise these games enough, and I will go on record saying that all the Metroid Prime games are brilliant. Actually, hold on a second, isn't there a black sheep of the Metroid Prime games that I'm forgetting? No, not that one, the other one. No, that's not a Metroid Prime game, the other one. That's not even the series, I'm talking about Metroid Prime Hunters. The game's first appearance was as Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt, a demo released with the Nintendo DS at launch to get people excited about what the DS could do. I had a friend who imported an American DS as the DS wasn't released until 2005 in Europe, and he let me play the demo. I was blown away by it, and it really had me excited for the full game. 2 years later, Metroid Prime Hunters was released and I got it day one. However, after beating it, I remember being disappointed, and I actually shortly sold my DS. Well, here I am a further 7 years later, and I decided to play through it again. So was I right to shun this game so quickly, or is it actually pretty enjoyable? Let's see. Usually I start a review by talking about the game's story, but due to how much of a large part the controls are, let's have a look at them first. Now, control has always been interesting with the Metroid Prime games, with the GameCube entries having to compensate for only having one real analog stick, and Metroid Prime 3 using the Wiimote and Nunchuck. Metroid Prime Hunters being on the DS means there are two control schemes, each one using the D-pad to move, but one uses the touchscreen to look around, while the other uses the X, Y, B, A buttons. I tried out both, and for the most part they both work very well. It doesn't compare to using two analog sticks, but I rarely found myself being annoyed about the lack of accuracy, and it didn't take too long to get used to them. What makes them work is that you can tweak the sensitivity to your liking, which is pretty much crucial, although I did stick with the default. With either control setup, the L button is used for firing and the R button is used for jumping. Other functions like the scan visor, morph ball and changing weapons are all on the touchscreen. This isn't bad, but it means that you have to stop controlling where you look to select them, which in the middle of a gunfight can mean you get hit. The touchscreen also features a radar, although it has a small range, so it isn't that useful. What would have been nice though is if they had a map on the touchscreen. With this being a Metroid game, the game isn't linear and you need to refer to your map regularly. Pausing the game to check the map is a bit of a pain, and it's made worse because the map itself is confusing, as it tries to replicate the console game's map, but it doesn't look as good and is hard to control. While the controls do work well, one thing that's odd is the lack of a lock-on system. I don't know how they could have integrated it, but all the other Metroid Prime games have lock-on to help you keep track of enemies and to strafe to avoid attacks. With no lock-on though, both of these things are harder to do, and the combat does sometimes suffer because of it. The story is that the Galactic Federation sends Samus to the Ambulix system to investigate a mysterious signal that talks about an ultimate power. It turns out that 6 other bounty hunters are also searching for this ultimate power, who are hostile towards Samus. The story isn't bad, and actually has a pretty good backstory, but the main problem is how it's told, as it's told in the same way as Metroid Prime 1 and 2. There are cutscenes but no dialogue, so the actual story is told by scanning blue floating blobs found in the game. The problem is the descriptions you get for them are very short, and most of the blue blobs are invisible, so to find them you just have to go around with the scan sensor and hope you get lucky. It means that really you don't care about finding them, and if you do care about finding them, it can be frustrating, as there's little logic to it and there's little reward to finding one. The scan visor overall feels pointless. Scanning enemies is pretty much pointless, and it doesn't really add anything to the gameplay. I know it would have been hard to call this a Metroid Prime game if they took out the scanning, but they either needed to make it as cool as it was in the console versions, or reinvent it somehow. The game is split into 3 different planets and a space station located within the Ambulix system. Metroid Prime 3 took place over different planets and it worked well there, but it doesn't work as well in Hunters. The first half of the game you go to each of the different locations one by one, find these 3 cubes in the levels, defeat the boss and gain a crystal. Once you get each crystal, you then have to return to each of the planets, as it turns out you need to get 8 crystals overall to beat the game. The problem with this is, first of all, the bosses become boring, as there's only really 2, and you just fight harder versions of themselves each time. They're not even that interesting bosses, which is a big deal in a Metroid game. The second reason why this is bad is because for some reason after every boss fight a counter starts and you have to return to your ship before the timer runs out. It's pretty cool the first time as a reference to the other Metroid games, but every time after that it becomes annoying and it feels more like padding than enjoyable gameplay. Another reason this structure of the overall game doesn't work is because of the structure of the individual planets. Exploring them the first time is fun, and it has the right mix of exploring an area and ultimately needing to end up at one point. When you have to return to them though, it's a complete mess. You have to return to areas that you haven't explored yet, but there's no guidance, so you don't know if what you're doing is actually helping towards getting a crystal or is a complete waste of time. Non-linear exploration in games needs some sort of guidance, as without it, nothing you do really feels satisfying. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad though if it wasn't for my next point, the hunters. As you explore areas you encounter the other hunters and have to fight them before moving on. Now when you're collecting the first 4 crystals, they're in specific places, and once you beat them, that's it and you can move on. I like the idea of fighting the hunters, and each of the designs are surprisingly cool and different to Samus's. However, when collecting the last 4 crystals, the hunters randomly appear in areas and you are required to fight them still. The idea of the hunters being in a system and actively moving around is once again cool, but it gets so tedious doing the same hunter fights over and over while trying to get around. I honestly can't understand this decision, as it makes backtracking a bigger chore than it already was, and it's made even worse by the Guardians. The Guardians are these fast little things that act a bit like the Hunters, as you can't leave an area until you've beaten them all, but they're much quicker than the Hunters and respawn. Why did they include respawning enemies? I know Prime 1 and 2 had them, but those games were much better designed, so the enemies didn't get in the way of the exploration, but in this game they constantly get in the way. The enemies might not have been so bad if it wasn't for the save and healing system. Instead of having save points, Samus can only save and heal at her ship, so you either have to backtrack to it or find a teleporter that warps you straight there. This would have been fine, but you can really feel the fact that the levels were not designed around this system. For example, once I was going through a new part of a planet and I took a lot of damage. I tried to grind some health, but no enemies dropped any, so I died. Unluckily for me, there are invisible checkpoints in this game, so you don't always return to your ship when you die, but the checkpoints don't restore your health. I was still very low on health, but I was ages away from my ship or a teleporter. When I tried to make it back, I encountered some Guardians, which I didn't have enough health to take on, as because of the controls and how quick they are, you will always take damage fighting anything. It would have been okay, but the doors were locked, so I had to kill them to return to my ship, which I couldn't do. In this one scenario, a lot of the problems of this game screamed out at me. The poor level design, the not quite precise controls, the broken save system, and the annoying respawning enemies. It feels like maybe if they weren't trying so hard to replicate the console Prime games, then these problems could have easily been avoided. Right, so let's look at some gameplay aspects of this game. This game features puzzles which are very similar to the puzzles in other Prime games, such as scan an object to get through, kill the enemies, etc. In this game though, the logic to the puzzle feels a bit off. Not bad, just off. For example, early on in the game you enter a room with a crystal thing in the middle. You scan it, it tells you what it is, but nothing happens. At the sides of the room are 2 holes that you can go into by using your morph ball. You go in them, there's nothing there. After looking around a bit, you then realise that there's a second scan point slightly higher up in the crystal which you are meant to scan to move on. Another example of the logic being a bit off is that you come into a room later on in the game. There's a thingy that you have to power up, and there's wasps' nests on the wires that you shoot at and you use your missiles on, but nothing happens to them. After looking around again, you scan a switch, and then the wasps come out of the nest, and then you can destroy the nests. Again, it's not bad, just off. A gameplay aspect that is used a lot in this game is the morph ball. At any point you can touch a button on the touch screen and turn into the morph ball, allowing Samus to enter smaller areas. The morph ball is used quite a lot in this game, and while it's not bad, it could have been better. It controls like it did in Metroid Prime 1, but here, because you're using the D-pad to control it, they don't work as well. It wouldn't have been a problem, but there are times where you have to roll onto small platforms, and it's a bit too easy to fall off when you didn't mean to. Another part of the gameplay is the new weapons. They work like they did in Metroid Prime 2, as in they have ammo. You can select one at a time and they can be pretty useful. I like how each weapon is actually completely new and separate from any other Metroid game, although I would have preferred it if the weapons stacked up and I didn't have to have ammo. Let's end this review on a more positive note by taking a look at the graphics. This has to be one of the most visually impressive games for the DS, with both the small details and the large open areas. Some areas do look a bit similar to locations in Metroid Prime 1, but overall it still looks great, and each planet does feel very unique and different to each other. Something else I should mention about this game is the multiplayer, as this was the first big Nintendo Online game. It's very limited, but I have to say that it's a lot of fun, and back in the day it was cool to play as the other hunters. If you can find people to play with somehow, then I say give the multiplayer a go, even if it is a bit shallow. Metroid Prime Hunters tries hard to be like its console counterparts, which is the game's biggest selling point as well as its biggest flaw. For a DS game, overall it's very impressive with the graphics, and at first this game is very enjoyable. However, the more you play, the more the gameplay problems creep in. This game wasn't made by Retro Studios, and it shows, as while this game replicates the Prime games pretty well, it doesn't show the same understanding of good level and game design. I wish they tried to make this game its own original title, as there's a lot of promise here, and there's a lot of cool things they could have done with the DS. As it stands though, while it isn't a terrible game, it's nowhere near as good as the original Metroid Prime games. My score is 7.0 out of 10. It's a pretty decent game that I would still recommend to Metroid fans to play, but once you beat it, you'll soon forget it.